Chapter 4. Makenna pulled open the door and stepped inside the small station first, but she could feel the hulking presence of Bubba behind her. Had he always been such a presence? She remembered him being handsome back then, but she'd been too focused on her career to notice many men. Plus, he'd been a suspect at first, making him unsuitable to date, but now she was settled and he was cleared, and she couldn't deny that he was attractive. "Hey, Captain," Clark, her newest recruit, said from the front desk. He had just graduated from the academy and was greener than she would have liked, but he seemed like a good kid. Eagerness and a willingness to learn were his best traits, and she would take those over a knowledgeable curmudgeon any day. "Clark," she nodded at him before continuing through to the evidence room. Tad, Kelsey, and Braden sat at their respective desks, but all looked up as they entered. "Guys, this is Matt Fisher, Bubba, the guy I was telling you about. He's the only one to escape the arsonist, and he's offered to lend whatever help he can. Bubba, you might remember Tad Brewer." She pointed to the dark-haired lieutenant before turning to her other two officers. "This is Kelsey Knight and Braden Cook." Tad stood first and extended a hand. "Good to see you again, man." The two men shook, and then Kelsey stood and threw out her hand as well. Kelsey had been the first one hired after Makenna's predecessor, Stillman, had made captain. She was good, thorough, and though her thinner frame misled people, she was tough as nails. Her blonde hair was pulled back in its customary ponytail, and her face was nearly devoid of makeup. Still young, she could pull it off, and there were days when Makenna envied that fresh face. "Nice to meet you, Bubba. Wish it was under better circumstances." "As do I." Braden was the last to stand. He'd sent his application in right after the arsonist story made the news. Makenna hadn't been sure whether he was simply chasing the story or if he was hoping to be the one to break the case. He was tall and lanky, and he had an ego the size of Texas. Had it been her decision, she might not have hired him, but he had turned out to be a decent cop. "Welcome, Bubba." "Okay, now that introductions are made, let's catch Bubba up on the case. As you remember, there were 3 women killed the first time." Makenna moved over to the board where pictures were hanging. She pointed first to the young, perky blonde. Daisy Johnson, who worked at the coffee shop you stopped at regularly. Her hand moved to the stunning brunette. Alexis Gibbons, who worked out at the same gym you did, and... Her finger moved one more time to the final picture, a pretty redhead with a dusting of freckles across her nose. "Clarissa Wiggins, who was a massage therapist and whom you dated briefly, am I right?" Bubba nodded, but his eyes were wide as he looked from one woman to the next. "When you lay it out like that, I can see why you thought I was a suspect." Makenna nodded. "You were the only link we could find between these 3 women. Clarissa and Daisy didn't attend the same gym Alexis did. Neither Alexis nor Clarissa drank much coffee, and we found no record that Daisy or Alexis were ever clients of Clarissa. So if the killer was after me, why go after these women? I barely knew Daisy. I mean, I spoke to her the mornings I ordered coffee, but I'd never seen her outside of the coffee shop. And Alexis led the aerobics classes at my gym, which I didn't take. The only one I had a true connection with was Clarissa, and we broke up months before she was killed. And it was amicable. That's what we've been trying to figure out." Tad spoke up and joined Makenna at the board. "At first we thought the killer was a spurned interest or something. All of these women are beautiful, so perhaps he tried to ask them out and was rejected. That made sense until the attempt on your life. When you were brought into the equation, we were left with 2 scenarios," Makenna continued. "Either the killer wanted to hurt you, and he chose these women because he thought they meant something to you, or you represented what he would never be. But if it were the latter, wouldn't he have kept killing even after me?" Bubba's eyes flicked from Tad to Makenna. "You said the killing stopped after the attempt on my life." "They did, until the other night. Now we have another victim." She motioned to Kelsey, who stood and took her place at the board. "This is Peter Smith," Kelsey said, pointing to a picture of a young-looking man. "Single, though we believe he had a girlfriend. He owned a repair shop on 5th that he opened a few years ago. There's only one other employee, and we're still working on his friends, but his parents live here as well. Bubba's brow creased as he gazed at the man. I don't understand. I don't know that man, and he isn't in the same occupation that I am. Does the killer want to be both of us? Makenna exchanged glances with her team. Bubba, not knowing Peter, did blow a hole in the first theory, and he was right. The other man didn't look like him. He was smaller, more average-looking, and his job didn't hold the clout that a firefighter's did. We don't know. She hated saying those words. She was supposed to be in control here, but this guy, if it was the same guy and not a copycat, just made no sense. Why the shift in victims? Why the long break? Why did he start killing again? There had to be some connection, some trigger, but she had no idea what it was. Before she could say more, the door to the room opened, and Natasha Kingston, head reporter for the Woodville Gazette, and a pure pain in Makenna's backside, burst into the room. Oh my word, it is true! Clark entered behind her, chagrined and apologetic. Sorry, Captain. She blew right past me. It's fine, Clark. Makenna had dealt with Natasha enough to know the woman took pushy to a whole new level. Clark would have been no match for her. What can I do for you, Natasha? Her bright red lips pursed as her eyes shifted from one person to the next until they finally landed on Bubba. I thought old Henry was yanking my chain when he burst into my office stating he had just seen a ghost. I almost wrote him off. I am in the middle of a big story, you know. But my back was aching, and I figured I could use a break. So I decided I would see if there was any truth to the ghost of Matt Fisher getting out of your squad car and entering the building. Boy, am I glad I did. Makenna rolled her eyes and stifled a sigh as Natasha pulled a portable recorder out of her purse and stepped toward Bubba. Matt, do you want to tell me your story? I'd be delighted to write an exclusive on you. Disgust erupted in Makenna's throat at the words that sounded more like a seductive purr than an actual question. While she wanted word to get out about Matt's return, Natasha would not have been her choice. Natasha, Matt just got to town. He hasn't even gotten the chance to see his family. Perhaps your exclusive could wait until tomorrow? Natasha turned to Makenna, a fake smile plastered on her face. Captain Drake, it is my job to deliver the news to the good people of Woodville, and this is definitely news. Now, I could run yet another story on how the police department has yet to find the killer, who is terrorizing our town after a 5-year hiatus. Or, she turned back to Bubba, you could give me a few minutes with our former hero here, and I could put out a much nicer piece. Makenna forced herself to remain calm. Natasha was a dislikable person, but she was just doing her job. Still, she didn't like the thought of Bubba being subjected to her, especially on his first day back before he'd even had the chance to reunite with his family. She looked to Bubba and shrugged. I'll leave the decision up to him. We're done here for the day anyway. Natasha's lips morphed into a sultry pout, and she placed a hand on Bubba's arm. What do you say, Matt? Can I have a few minutes of your time? Though the desire to say no was written all over his face and evident in his posture, Bubba nodded. Sure, I can give you a few minutes, on one condition. What's that? You don't run the story until tomorrow. I want to talk to my folks before they read it in the paper. Her lips pursed as she appeared to think over the offer. It was early afternoon, and Makenna thought Natasha could get a paper out tonight if she busted her butt. But did she want to work that hard? Besides, evening papers were a rarity in Woodville, and most people wouldn't read it until the following morning anyway. Fine. I promise not to print it until tomorrow. Then you have yourself a deal. Makenna wanted to apologize for putting Bubba on the spot, but there was no chance to get him alone during the short walk down the hall to one of the conference rooms. She waited in the doorframe for an invitation to sit in, but when he didn't offer one, she took the hint and closed the door. He was an adult, and he could take care of himself. So why did she hate the thought of leaving him alone with Natasha? Bubba settled in his seat and leaned back. He was familiar with Natasha and knew that for the next few minutes he would need to choose his words carefully. She was a good journalist, but like most, she tended to focus on the words that would make her story pop and bury the rest, even if it ended up twisting the meaning of the interviewee. Thankfully, he had avoided most situations with her when he worked at the firehouse, but he'd heard his captain complain more than once when what she printed took his words out of context. "So, Matt, why did you let everyone here think you were dead 5 years ago? Were you hiding something?" "On the contrary, after the attempt on my life, Captain Drake and I thought my death might keep the killer from going after my family." "Really? You left your job as a fireman, deserted, basically, and you want us to believe you did it to save your family? You were a suspect originally, am I right?" Bubba didn't like where this was going, and he knew the spin on it would do nothing for his image. He didn't care so much about that as he did about the backlash that would fall on his parents. They'd probably already had to deal with questions and pitying looks and apologies for the last 5 years. He didn't want any more grief put on them. He leaned forward and stared into Natasha's eyes. She was tough, but he was tougher, bigger, and had much more at stake. "I know you want a sensational story, Natasha, but that is the truth." "Perhaps it is." Confidence flowed out of her voice and her steely eyes never wavered. "But I find it odd that you were the main suspect until your house caught fire. And then after your death, the fire stopped. Don't you find that a little coincidental?" "I might, if I were you, and if they hadn't started back up again. What's your spin on that, Natasha? I was hundreds of miles away when this latest one happened." She smiled, but it was not a warm, friendly smile. More the smile of a predator searching for her next meal. "I think there are 2 possibilities. Either you came back early and wanted us to think you were still wherever you've been hiding so that you would have an alibi, or you have someone here you've been in contact with doing your dirty work." Bubba shook his head and leaned away from her. "You have quite the imagination, Natasha. But why don't you try this one on? Imagine that you were the subject of a murder investigation, even though you had dedicated your life to saving people. Imagine waking up to the smell of smoke and knowing that everything you own will soon be a pile of black ash. Imagine that you are told the only way to save the ones you love is to leave them forever, never communicate with them, and try to pretend they never existed. Imagine having to move to a new town with a name you've never been called, with a past not your own, and try to fit in." He pushed back his chair and stood up. "And if you finish that and still think you should write the story in your head, then I want you to think about your parents. Think about them mourning you for 5 years and having to deal with questions and stares from the neighbors and people they once called friends. Imagine their joy when they realize you're alive, and then their utter destruction when someone fabricates a story about you and calls it news simply because they can." Her mouth opened, but Bubba had no intention of letting her have the last word. "You can write whatever story you want, Natasha, but God help your soul if you write the trash you can't back up with facts and pretend it's truth." With that, he walked out of the room and found himself face to face with an embarrassed Makenna. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to listen." The corners of her lips twitched as if fighting a smile. "But that was great. You don't know how many times I wanted to tell that woman off. But in my position—" "Makenna," he said, cutting her off, "can you take me to see my parents?" He wasn't mad at Makenna, but frustration raged through him. Her smile faltered as she shifted back into her profession. "Right. Of course. I'll take you right away." "Makenna." He grabbed her arm as she stepped away from him. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to snap at you. It's just been a long day, and I have no idea what that woman is going to write. I'd just like to spend some time with my parents before—" He shrugged. "You know." She offered a small smile. I do. So let's get you home.